This week on Jerusalem Dateline, President Obama crosses the threshold to sustain his presidential veto on the Iranian nuclear deal. But critics say the agreement will let Iran cross the nuclear threshold and put Israel and the United States in peril. Plus, ISIS, what you should know about this terrorist state. Do they really have a plan to take over the world? And Europe faces a wave of migrants, and some wonder if Europe will still be Europe when the flood subsides. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. They chant death to America in Iran. Even so, President Obama just got enough votes this week so his nuclear deal can pass the Senate. That's despite warnings the plan will clear the way for Iran to build nuclear weapons. Even after they've made an agreement with the United States and 5 other world powers, Iran's leaders are still making it clear they consider the U.S. the great Satan. George Thomas has the story.
As the State Department officials continue to stress the president's statement that the U.S. would still impose further sanctions should Iran change its behavior toward the deal, and that the plan would prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power.
We've been very clear about what this agreement is about. It's about stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
But opponents like retired General Jerry Boykin say the deal will actually have the opposite effect.
This is, in fact, a pathway to Iran having a nuclear weapon.
Boykin and nearly 200 other retired U.S. generals and admirals appealed to Congress in a letter last week to reject the deal. Boykin says the agreement also gives Iran access to more money to fund terror groups around the world.
There's going to be a large amount of money, $150 billion. I've heard estimates over a 5-year period that run as much as $700 billion. That is going to go into the coffers of a very rogue Islamic regime who is the biggest sponsor of terrorism. That means that Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terrorist organizations are going to get a lot of money, which they can use against their 2 primary enemies, which is Israel and America.
Will be permitted.
As chances of stopping the deal dwindle, Republicans are planning to push new legislation for sanctions targeting the finances of Iranian institutions that support terror. One of them is Tehran's elite military unit, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. On Tuesday, the unit's commander issued this warning.
America is still the great Satan.
A sentiment that was also echoed the same day during the opening session of Iran's powerful clerical body.
This nuclear deal will under no circumstances alter our country's foreign policy. The Islamic Republic of Iran considers the U.S. its #1 enemy.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas is one of the most outspoken critics of the Iranian nuclear deal. Cotton visited Israel this week and explained to us why he says this agreement may be one of the worst in American history. Senator Cotton, thank you for being with us right now.
It's great to be here with you.
What do you see as the flaws in the Iranian nuclear deal?
Well, there's multiple flaws in the nuclear deal with Iran. That's why I've opposed it so strongly. I think it's dangerous for the United States, dangerous for our allies like Israel, and dangerous for world peace. I would look at it in at least 3 different ways. First, in the immediate and non-nuclear dimension, putting aside whatever will happen with Iran's nuclear program, we're going to give tens of billions of dollars in immediate sanctions relief to a government that is still the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism, that has the blood of hundreds of American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan on its hands, that still chants death to America and death to Israel in the streets. Second, even if Iran follows the deal to the letter, they are going to be a nuclear threshold state in a mere 10 to 15 years, which, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, is the blink of an eye in the life of nations. But third, Iran, unfortunately, doesn't have a reputation or history of following its international obligations. So they're likely to develop nuclear weapons capability well before the 10 to 15-year period concludes.
And how did you find out about the secret deals between the IAEA and Iran? And what do you think about the secret deal that's been released so far?
So there's 2 secret side deals between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency. The first is a very limited scope, which would deal with Parchin, a military base where we believe Iran tested nuclear detonators. The second is a much broader issue regarding the past military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, which is a critical baseline to inspect their program going forward. Not having that baseline would be kind of like starting a diet without knowing your starting weight. But it's not the IAEA that has the obligation to disclose those those side agreements to us. It's the United States government that has the obligation because there is federal law that requires it. And the administration still to this day has not obtained those agreements. They have not provided them to the Congress or the American people, even though they're not U.S. government documents. They weren't obtained through sensitive, clandestine sources or methods. And Iran knows what it agreed to. I think the United States government should obtain the agreements and they should release the agreements. The Associated Press reported a couple weeks ago what purported to be the content of the Parchin agreement, which is again the more narrow and limited agreement, which would essentially allow Iran to inspect itself, to take its own environmental samples, to do its own video and its own photography. That's kind of like letting an NFL player take his own drug test at home and mail it in to Roger Goodell at NFL offices so he can establish his eligibility.
Why is this so significant and important to the American people?
The nuclear deal itself is so significant because of the nature of the Iranian regime. There are plenty of countries in the world that are nuclear threshold capable. Japan is probably the best example. The American people don't worry about Japan and its nuclear power program because Japan is a peaceful constitutional democracy. Iran, however, is run by radical clerics who continually chant death to America and death to Israel in the street, led by their national leadership. They have the blood of hundreds of Americans on their hands from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They continue to try to kill Jews all around the world, not just in Israel, but in places like Bulgaria and Argentina. And they are destabilizing the entire Middle East, fomenting terrorism in Lebanon and Gaza, also propping up Bashar al-Assad in Syria, supporting a Shiite insurgency in Yemen. We're going to give them tens of billions of dollars. We're going to lift sanctions on their oil and other economic transactions. We're going to lift the conventional arms embargo, and ultimately we'll even lift sanctions on their ballistic missile program, all the while allowing them to develop their nuclear program. So what does that mean? That means that in just a few years, Iran's going to have a stronger, more resilient economy that can withstand future sanctions if they cheat on a deal. They're going to have a stronger conventional army, and they're going to be on the verge of nuclear weapons capability.
Do you think this deal could lead to war in the Middle East?
I think this deal is actually more likely to produce a war than it is to deter a war, which is the exact opposite of what President Obama intended. Just like I think it's more likely to lead to nuclear proliferation in the Middle East rather than avoid nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. Again, the opposite of what President Obama intended, in part because it shows that the United States is not willing to play our traditional role of being a force for stability throughout the region. And we are encouraging other countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates to take their own path, to perhaps get their own nuclear weapons, which is what some leaders of those countries have suggested publicly, and many have suggested privately to me and other members of the United States Congress.
Senator Cotton, I appreciate your time and great to be with you.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Up next, it's the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Middle Eastern and North African refugees are swarming Europe, and many wonder when it will stop. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. Refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and North Africa are pouring into Europe. Tragically, many have died on their journey. But what happens if the migrant surge doesn't stop? Dale Hurd reports from Stockholm and Brussels.
It's a staggering humanitarian crisis, the largest refugee influx since World War II. More than 300,000 Africans and Asians have crossed Europe's border this year, double last year's pace. Hundreds more have died trying in just the past few weeks. But the other side of this tragedy is how it will change Europe. Non-Western migrants had already been flooding into Europe for decades. Leaders refused to stop it for many reasons. Some saw migrants as cheap labor. Others were afraid of being branded racist for opposing it. But long before the present crisis, experts were asking if Europe would still be Europe if immigrants someday outnumbered natives.
It's increasingly clear in Western European countries that as the populations approach a tipping point, that there are increasing groups of people who are essentially asking the question, if the political establishment continues to get its way, in 5, in 10, in 20 years' time, how many Germans are going to be left in Germany? How many French people are going to be left in France? How many English people are going to be left in England?
French writer Renaud Camus calls the influx the Great Replacement and says it's the biggest thing to happen to France since the 15th century.
Because what is happening is the population is changing. Can France be the same with a different people? And obviously the answer is no.
For years, Sweden has taken in more migrants per capita than any other European nation, and the experiment has not gone well. Segregation and unemployment among migrants remain high. Predominantly migrant gangs have developed a habit recently of throwing hand grenades at each other during street battles. Last year, Swedish police reported that some areas had become dangerous for law enforcement to enter. Officials denied that the areas are no-go zones, but what was described to us certainly sounded like no-go zones.
Police officers and also fire brigade, ambulance services, when they are coming to these areas, they are attacked. The kids are throwing stones at them, and let's say they are more or less riots. So the police have been attacked by youngsters and so on, of course. So there's a lot of firearms, handguns, especially.
Swedish economist Tino Sanandaji says his country's model faces collapse.
You don't have to be Nostradamus to predict the future. You go to cities like Malmö, Sweden's third city, that are 20 years ahead demographically. That's what the rest of Sweden is going to be. And Malmö has of the 300 Swedish municipalities, it's bottom 10, whatever social outcome you look, employment, unemployment, school outcomes, poverty.
Sweden's immigration policy doesn't work. The statistics clearly prove it. So why is Sweden bringing in more and more immigrants? And why are opponents of immigration in Sweden and other Western nations branded as racist?
We protest the erecting of fences that just basically make the passage more dangerous.
Sanandaji believes the Swedish left's obsession with immigration and racism has become a kind of religious substitute.
If you want to sort of psychologize, Sweden is one of the most secular countries in the world, okay? They've lost their moral grounding because and the elitists in particular are aggressively anti-religion, right? So, but people, of course, need some sort of spirituality, morality, some values. And instead, their values are anti-racism. So they created this alternative reality for themselves, where it's the 1930s, and they're the guys fighting Hitler.
But more and more Swedes seem to finally have had enough, because the right-wing anti-immigration Sweden Democrats are now the most popular party in the country.
The local municipalities, government authorities around the country, they're all saying it's not working. We're standing before the collapse of the system almost in Sweden. People living in the multicultural chaos that they created, they see this.
Right-wing nationalist parties are strengthening in most European nations because in many cases the establishment seems unwilling or unable to stop the migrant influx. A new poll shows immigration is now the #1 political issue in Britain. Gerard Batten is a founding member of UKIP, the UK Independence Party.
Why would you allow unlimited immigration? It's madness. But it's a political thing, you see, is that so long as you've got these open borders, the political elite, the left-wing political elite can say, oh, we're good people because, we're not racist like the nasty people who want to control immigration.
Almost 1 million migrants have arrived in Germany this year alone. German public support for open borders is falling. Asylum shelters are being firebombed. The fear of open borders in Europe seems to be the same fear that is helping to power Donald Trump's surprising campaign for president. Desperate people in need deserve to be helped, but many are asking what will happen to Europe if the refugee surge doesn't stop. Dale Hurd, CBN News, reporting from Europe.
Coming up, a deeper look into ISIS with Islamic expert Robert Spencer. What their goals are, and why they pose a threat to the rest of the world. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. President Obama once called them the JV team, but ISIS is a deadly terrorist group. They're committing unspeakable murders and atrocities, and they're gaining ground in Iraq and Syria. Yet after all this, many people still don't know very much about this radical Islamic group. Take a look.
ISIS, or the Islamic State, burst on the international scene in 2014 when it took over huge swaths of Iraq and Syria. Today, ISIS controls a land area the size of Great Britain and is the wealthiest jihadist organization in the world. As it expands, Islamic State forces bring chaos and savagery wherever they go. Despite what we know about ISIS, there is much that remains mysterious until now. In his new book, The Complete Infidels Guide to ISIS, terrorism expert Robert Spencer reveals everything you need to know about ISIS and how to stop its reign of terror.
Robert, first of all, thanks so much for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You wrote a book called The Complete Infidels Guide to ISIS. First of all, Robert, why did you write the book?
I think that there is so much misinformation and disinformation about ISIS at the highest levels that it's hamstringing our ability to deal with it, and it's a universal thing. It's not just the President of the United States who says that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, but the entire government, the opposition party, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, virtually every authority in the Western world is in denial.
And what is the motivating ideology of ISIS, and what are their goals?
Well, I'll tell you, ISIS is quintessentially Islamic. It's not just an Islamic group. It styles itself as being the Islamic group, the Caliphate. They are guided by the example of Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran, which mandate warfare against and subjugation of unbelievers. The only earthly authority to which any Muslim owes allegiance, according to Sunni Muslim theology, is to the Caliph. This is proven already to be an extraordinarily powerful claim.
It seems like almost like a siren song that ISIS is drawing them to. What's the attraction?
Well, certainly they do say this is the perfect Islamic state. This is the Islamic state where Islamic law is fully in effect. Nowhere else in the world can that be said. This is the Islamic State where there is the Caliph, and nowhere else in the world can that be said. All these things are based on Quranic teaching, and Muslims know this.
You know, and it seems like, and you write about it in the book, that ISIS has actually penetrated the United States. There was a story just a few weeks ago about this couple from Mississippi State University that were arrested, but on their way to try to get to ISIS. How has ISIS penetrated the United States?
They do it by means of social media. They are very sophisticated in their use of the internet, of Twitter, of Facebook. But the main thing is not so much the means by which the message is conveyed, but the message itself. And that message is powerful among American Muslims because it is so deeply rooted within Islamic tradition.
What is their view of the end times? Do they feel like we're on the precipice of the last great battles in Armageddon?
Yes, they do. And they think they're going to be able to bring it about within the next 10 years. By the year 2025, they expect to be fighting the titanic last battle between Muslims and non-Muslims, as prophesied according to Islamic tradition by Muhammad himself. He said that the Romans, by which he appears to have meant the Christians, all the non-Muslims, would gather at Dabiq, which is a town in northern Syria that the Islamic State actually does control at this time.
What we're seeing right now in the news over here, at least in this part of the world, is just a huge wave of migrants flowing into Europe right now from places like Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq. Do you see this as a potential danger to Western European countries?
There is no doubt it's an absolute and immediate danger. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact, there were discovered several Islamic State jihadis among these so-called migrants. And the Islamic State is already threatened. We are going to flood Europe with refugees. They mean refugees who will include among them jihad warriors.
Yeah. And what about Christians in the Middle East? What kind of danger does ISIS represent to Christianity in this part of the world?
The Islamic State has vowed to reimpose the system of dhimmitud, which is the Quranic and Islamic legal system that mandates second-class status for Christians and other non-Muslims. They have to pay a special tax, the jizya, and accept a subservient, subjugated status denying the basic rights under the rule of the Muslims. The entire area of Mosul, which had been a Christian area since the time of Jesus, is now completely clear of Christians. The Archbishop, the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Mosul said, "I have lost my entire diocese to Islam." And the same thing is going to happen in Europe and America unless people wake up.
Wow. Yeah, we had an opportunity, really the privilege, to interview some of those people that fled Mosul last summer when ISIS came in. Robert, if you had to take like a 30,000-foot view of the Middle East, some people may look at it as a blur, so much fighting going on. What would you say? What do people need to know about what's happening in the Middle East right now?
They need to know that the groups like ISIS are not some twisted, hijacked version of Islam that is a terror group that is abhorred and rejected by most Muslims. They need to know that the Islamic State is making recruits among peaceful Muslims and winning broad support among peaceful Muslims by virtue of justifying and explaining their actions with reference to Islamic texts and teachings, the Quran and the Sunnah, the example of Muhammad. And that means that this is an appeal far broader than just the Islamic State itself. And we have to address that if we're ever going to come up with any effective means to counter it. But we also have to remember that this is a spiritual battle, that this is a concentratedly evil force, that they say, we will win because we love death more than you love life. And we know that the author of life will never allow death to conquer life. And so ultimately the Islamic State will not prevail. But we have to understand that this is, just as they say, the struggle between good and evil in a very stark sense.
How would you describe or characterize or assess the battle right now by the Obama administration and by other Western powers against ISIS?
You know, they're in complete denial. Obama insists that the Islamic State is not Islamic. That hamstrings our ability to fight it in numerous ways. It's an adage as old as warfare that you cannot defeat an enemy that you don't understand. And the Obama administration refuses to understand this enemy.
Well, Robert, congratulations on the book. Thanks for being with us on Jerusalem Dateline, and all the best.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, a look back at some of the stories from last season and a look ahead to the next. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. The broadcast year, as opposed to the calendar year, begins in the fall. We've just finished Season 4 of Jerusalem Dateline, and we're now beginning Season 5. This past year, we've been able to cover the major events of the year in the Middle East, including the expansion of ISIS, the signing of the Iranian nuclear deal, a pivotal election here in Israel, and groundbreaking archaeological discoveries, and prophecy fulfilled as the Jewish people return to Israel. We look ahead this year to cover more of those major events taking place here in the Middle East that shape history and affect your life. We appreciate you joining us along the journey. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter throughout the week, and now along with Periscope. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.